And welcome to this episode of the Good Citizen Podcast. Today I want to dive into the topic legal challenges in Christian education. Legal challenges in Christian education. Now, some listeners may be thinking, I'm not a school principal, I'm not a Christian school teacher, and so how would this apply to me? And I'll say that all Christians are called to work in the area of discipleship, to train up the next generation in the way that they should go in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. And certainly that is most specifically for parents. However, I do think that as a church, we come alongside. And the Christian school, if this Christian school defines its mission properly, it is partnering with parents to raise up disciples, champions for Christ in the next generation. And so Christian schools, I think, are often on the front lines of many of the religious liberty fights, because certainly the enemy knows raising up that next generation in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Education has always been a battleground of ideas, and so this may specifically address Christian schools. However, it certainly could impact churches and homeschooling with these legal trends. So I do think there is something here for everyone that is working in the space of, if you're in church world, if you're in Christian school world, these things are all going to come and impact us. Now, if you're watching over on YouTube, I will have a PowerPoint up over there. If you'd like to follow along, just kind of see this visually, what we're looking at. And so legal challenges in Christian education, I'll jump first into some legal and cultural developments that I do think impact the legal space. As often the law is a little bit downstream from culture and from politics is there in the mix, but certainly legal issues are impacted by cultural changes. So the first cultural development that I might say is the curious rise of the religious left and the secular right. I'll say that again, the curious rise of the religious left and the secular right. If you've been listening to the podcast for any time at all, I've told these stories of how kind of boots in the ground, we are seeing an increasingly religious left coming in, not saying, hey, science says, or there is no God, but actually saying God is for certain ideas like this sexual revolution. And that hits different. Now, and I've told stories about how I was really frustrated one day when a faith leader, a self-declared faith leader, got up at the podium and said, why are we basing our morality on a 2,000-year-old book, and declared that God is for things that Scripture is clearly against. And that is a challenge, because now we're having to come into the public square and say, here's what God actually has said, here's what the church has believed for 2,000 years and more. I do, in a sense, welcome this. Nobody's acting anymore like religion or morality doesn't impact public life. But also we're seeing on the secular right, those that may embrace conservative ideas, maybe Republican office holders, but the ideas they're espousing are not necessarily religiously motivated. They may just be more populist opinion, a part of kind of conservative politics, but not necessarily religiously driven. And that also can be a challenge for some of the things we're going to talk about today. Also, the sexual revolution has shifted from an acceptance phase to an enforcement phase. And we've talked a lot about these different types of cases. For example, if an employee is at work and they simply ask for religious accommodation, please, I'll refer to somebody using a name, but I can't use those preferred pronouns. I can't do that because that is a truth statement. I'm not going to lie. And that having employment consequences. And that's just one example of, it's not okay just to accept, in a sense, or realize that we're part of a plural society. No, you have to get on the bandwagon with this revolution. You have to celebrate it with them. And that is an entirely different phase and something that Christians have to be aware of. Another concerning development, and we had on just last week Dr. Adam Rasmussen talking about cultural changes, syncretism, but that one stat that just breaks my heart is something like 6% of American Christians have a biblical worldview. And so if there is anything that is important right here, right now, it is training up the next generation with a biblical worldview. And so that stat continues to hammer home the importance of this exercise we call Christian education. Certainly the rise of artificial intelligence, this is impacting every area. I think it is the new iPhone of 2006 and 7 to the social media, but perhaps it's even more fundamental, more profound in how it's going to impact us. And that certainly impacts Christian education, where students can get onto ChatGPT, write papers, but also who is going to ensure that these large language models aren't poisoned, in the sense of, if a teenager types in, is there a God? Are these models going to be friendly to theism? So there's so many questions there about the ethical use of this. And then I might say the uncommon return of common sense, as we have seen even from at the federal level, executive orders saying that we're going to treat biological reality as a reality. And there are attempts now to reform the Department of Education, even do away with it, sending some of this back to the local areas. And so hopefully we're getting just a breath of fresh air here. I don't think anyone is naive in the sense that, hey, all these executive orders could be done away with a stroke of a pen. But hey, we'll take this uncommon return of common sense, at least for now. So I wanted to mention a few of those. There may be some others that you would think of, but those were some developments that certainly impact what we're going to talk about today. So next, I wanted to jump in to just kind of where we are legally. And for new listeners, I wanted to roll through this. If you've been listening for some time, this is review. But I use what I would term these jurisprudential bubbles. And so if you think of these three bubbles, in the innermost bubble is the church, and then in the second bubble going outward is the school, and then the outermost bubble is the marketplace. As you think of a time like 1952, where all three of those bubbles were strong, and I use bubble for a reason, in the sense that James Madison said that the Constitution is made up of our rights, our parchment barriers. We hope that they're concrete. They should be concrete, but sometimes they can be perforated, eviscerated, fade and tear over time if we're not careful. And so you think of a time where even in the marketplace, Christians were free to live out their faith. But then we move forward into, say, the 2013 era. And then some of the cases that I've talked about. We've talked about John Klug, a teacher at public school, who simply asked for an accommodation. Hey, I just want to use these kids' last names. I can't in good conscience use their preferred pronouns, and that leading to eventual firing, termination. And that case has gone back and forth up at the Seventh Circuit. And then I think now with the marketplace, we also have, in a sense, that school bubble. So the outermost bubble, marketplace. The next bubble is the school. And in the 2015 case of Bergefell versus Hodges, this was the same-sex marriage decision. The Solicitor General of the United States said, hey, it's going to be an issue if you have schools that have housing. And this is seen as an actual right, a constitutional right. And so that independent, kind of board-run Christian school, there are still a lot of challenges there. And then I believe the church is the most protected area in American law. But if you can get through the marketplace and then through the school, where do you think they're going to come next? So with that in mind, I'm going to just jump into 5 key legal issues. Now, I'll put a disclaimer at the end that, hey, this does not give us an attorney-client relationship, and we need to have any specific situation vetted. But I'll roll through legal foundation, employment, admissions, accreditation and tax exemption, and the Christian school and immigration. And of course, I'm only going to be able to do a bit of a high-level review here, but my goal with this is not so much that you remember everything that I say, but that if you're in this area, or you have kids in a Christian school, your friends to a Christian school, that you could issue spot. That's something we say in the law, where you can, when you hear something or you see something, you think, aha, this is something that I need to pay attention to. So the first thing I would say, this legal foundation. In the context of Christian ministries, it is so critical that you define what you intend to defend. You define what you intend to defend, meaning that you set out in your statement of faith, we are a religious institution, that you use scripture references, and that throughout your processes, your handbooks, your employment applications, your student applications, that all of this is couched in your religious language and your religious mission. A great example of this within the last couple of weeks was Catholic Charity Bureaus versus Wisconsin. This case, if you followed, there were divisions of Catholic Charities Bureau that looked like any other business. and yet they had claimed exemption from unemployment taxes. And so this issue went into litigation, ended up all the way at the U.S. Supreme Court. And one of the issues that I certainly took away, or one of the lessons I took away from this case, is define what you intend to defend. So a couple of thoughts here. If you're in a sample church school, or this is a school that's underneath a church, things like your articles of incorporation, the church's articles of incorporation, making sure they have a strong religious purpose statement, drafting or revising the Constitution and bylaws, including a specific provision on the school ministry. How is that overseen? Is there a requirement that all of the teaching and instruction in the school is in compliance with the church's statement of faith, that everyone that is hired at the school is going to abide by and agree with the church's statement of faith? Developing and reviewing teacher handbooks and contracts, and then reviewing parent-student handbooks and admission applications. Again, everything being consistent with the church's statement of faith. Now, if it's an independent, board-run Christian school, as many Christian schools are, you're just looking at that organization's articles of incorporation. This is the document that's filed with the state. If the articles of incorporation and the bylaws conflict, generally the articles are going to control. And so you want to make sure that your school's governance is clearly set out, that your board of directors is required to agree with your statement of faith, generally support the ministry. Again, defining what you intend to defend. Applying for state and federal tax exemption is something that is generally done. And you want, again, to make sure that your religious purpose statement is woven throughout these documents, making sure your teacher handbooks and contracts and your parent-student handbooks and admission applications all build back on the statement of faith, on the bylaws that have defined your organization as religious. So that may seem very, very basic and very, very simple, but I can tell you so many schools have just shelved some of these documents in the back of a drawer somewhere, and they need to have the latest religious liberty protections. They need to have these basic tenets, the religious purpose, all set out. So that's a key one, a legal foundation. The second one is employment. And this is one I wanted to spend just a little bit of time on because it is perhaps the greatest opportunity for religious schools. And so a couple of reminders is back in 2020 in the Bostock case. Bostock had to do with a Christian-owned funeral home that had an employee that left. It was male, came back declaring himself to be female, and the organization terminated that position, saying, hey, this is a frontline position. This is contrary to our beliefs. That case went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court held that the term sex in Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, that has to do with employment, that the word sex means sexual orientation and gender identity, including those classifications in the term sex. Now, one of the issues with that case is that the case did not answer the question of how this impacts religious ministries. Well, within just about 2 weeks, the U.S. Supreme Court came back in a case called Lady of Guadalupe and said that the ministerial exception focuses on what an employee does. And so I want to underline this. The ministerial exception is the most important employee or employment legal protection that ministries have. And essentially it means that if an individual is in a ministerial capacity, now when I think of minister, I think of a pastor, but the law is very clear that a minister is essentially anyone that is teaching the ministry's religious doctrine, modeling the religious doctrine to its adherents. And in both key landmark U.S. Supreme Court cases on this issue, the term ministerial exception or minister has been applied to Christian school teachers. And so in employment contracts, you want to be very clear about Christian school teachers being required to teach and model the faith to the next generation. And so very clearly setting this out. Now, that doesn't mean that a church and a school can't hire and fire other positions based on their statement of faith. In fact, that is actually being currently litigated in the Union Gospel Mission case out in the Pacific Northwest. And for kind of the first time since Bostock, since 2020, there's finally a little bit more clarification. But I believe the right position is that ministries have the right to hire and fire anybody, whether that's a teacher or a janitor or just a secretary or an individual making lunches based on their statement of faith. My simple point is that the clearest and greatest protection is for ministerial employees, those that teach the faith to the next generation. So why not very clearly claim that in your school's documents, in your teacher handbooks, in your employee handbooks? And so that is perhaps the most important thing that I might say in this episode, and just want to clearly underline that. Now, as a ministry, the Good Citizen Project does have legal partnerships. I don't talk about it probably enough, but we do offer legal partnerships to ministries to assist with review, making sure things like the Articles of Incorporation are correct, the bylaws are correct, teacher contracts are reviewed, etc. So you can contact us at just info@goodcitizen.us, or just look at goodcitizen.us, what we do, legal partnerships, if you'd like some more information. Another issue is admission and discipline. And here, like your teacher contracts, you want to clarify at the very beginning of the relationship with a parent and with a student what your expectations are. And so there are different types of Christian schools. Some are open enrollment, meaning they're going to pretty much invite anybody to come in and partner with the school. Others are closed in that they would require the parents to also sign a statement of faith, a code of conduct, or be a part of a church that the school is affiliated with. But you very clearly want to set out in that admission document, here's who we are. We expect, especially kids in older grades, to also be in agreement with the statement of faith, to be living a life that on and off campus that models that, and that discipline can be based on failure to live up to those standards. And then if you have a student that becomes upset, or parents become upset because you've held that student to that standard, maybe ended the relationship with the school, dismissed them, you can come to any arbitration or any sort of lawsuit with what we call in the law kind of clean hands, saying, hey, we set this out at the very beginning. This was a contract, and this was the basis of it. Now, another issue, accreditation and tax exemption. I know we're moving quickly here, but accreditation and tax exemption. Christian schools, many of them now, are accredited in some way and also seek tax exemption. Now, one last thing, I may go back to point number 3 just briefly here. The admission and discipline piece of this, I think parental rights plays into this issue because the school is partnering with the parents. And so one issue that we've seen, if Christian parents are dealing with an issue like a transgender ideology, we mentioned Mary and Jeremy Cox, my clients, we appealed the case all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. They just could not in good conscience refer to their child as according to their child's transgender ideology, doing everything possible for their child. Unfortunately, their child was removed from their custody over this issue. And so what do you think happens if a parent is being scrutinized in a state like Minnesota, now Colorado, that happened this last week, or California or Washington, where the parents cannot in good conscience provide quote-unquote gender-affirming care, and the state wants to come in and investigate them? Well, if that child's in a Christian school, who do you think gets pulled into that? And so admission and discipline, I think because of the school's partnership with parents, that could become an issue. And I'm showing over on the video just a copy of that petition and our argument to the court. Now, one way that we are pushing back on this issue is that there is now a bill in Indiana, just providing some information here, that would include language that child abuse or neglect does not include raising or referring to a child in a manner consistent with a child's biological sex. Many people are like, do we really have to put that in the law? Well, yes, due to some developments. So something else to consider, you're thinking about accreditation, thinking about tax exemption, and this is the ability of Christian counselors to be able to teach the next generation about what the Bible says about human sexuality. I'm showing a picture here of a counselor named Childs in the case Childs v. Salazar that the U.S. Supreme Court has accepted saying that, hey, licensure to be a therapist or counselor should not be based on viewpoint, and that Christians should be free to share their beliefs. Something similar happened in Lafayette, Indiana, and the ministry Faith, which has a large Christian counseling group, pushed back on that issue in Lafayette, Indiana, West Lafayette, Indiana. And so you can see this push to kind of, there can only be one acceptable way to handle some of these ideologies, moving from acceptance to enforcement, back to our initial point. And so the Christian school can kind of be brought into all of that as either part of the public relations or even legal proceedings. I mentioned accreditation and tax exemption, kind of back to that issue, that accreditation should not be based on a school's viewpoint on particular issues, and that it does not seem to be as big of a concern as before. And I think the more Christian schools are part of these different national accrediting organizations or even regional accrediting organizations, that helps us make a better argument. Also, tax exemption. And if you followed a case out of Maine, this is called Bangor Christian Schools. Maine has this very unique program where there are parts of Maine that are so small or so sparsely populated that they don't have public schools. And so there are some private schools that can get public tuition dollars, essentially. Bangor had to fight all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court to say, hey, you can't just exclude us because of our beliefs. And so they won that case, and then they came back in to qualify for some of the program. The Supreme Court said, hey, you have to be included in that. And then, lo and behold, the Attorney General says, well, you have to sign this non-discrimination statement on the areas of sexual orientation and gender identity, or you can't participate. And so that case is now ongoing. And so tax exemption can be an issue. I often say the best way to defend religious freedom is to use it. And so I'm grateful that this Christian school continues to pursue that, saying, look, you can't have these programs that are generally available and then exclude us because we're religious. That is not neutrality. That is hostility to religion. And then one last issue I wanted to get into would be Christian schools and immigration. But something that I encourage Christian schools to look at closely is any type of discounted service. Like one example would be Google for nonprofits. I have something here where it says that you'd have to confirm to use this CRM that you do not base any of your hiring employment practices or administration, including on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity, that your organization does not discriminate. Now, I would argue that Christian schools do not discriminate based on those, but rather base their decisions on their statement of faith. But this could certainly be used if a school checked that box against it, saying, hey, you don't hold your beliefs sincerely because you jeopardized it to get access to a CRM. One of our recent guests, Dr. Christopher Ewan, in his ministry actually sued the organization Asana because they prevented them from having access to it because of what they teach and preach on this issue. So this is just something else to pay attention to. In the episode on the church immigration, ordered loves, and ICE raids, we did talk about how it doesn't matter what setting it is in. Parental rights matter, and so if government agents are coming in, we want to certainly notify parents unless there's a judicial warrant to the contrary, and you would have to look at these situations in a kind of facts and circumstance one by one, but that there is a difference between an administrative ICE warrant and a judicial warrant. And so like any government official coming to a school, whether it would be ICE or a Department of Child Services or welfare organization, you're going to want to treat them respectfully, ask for documentation, and then, if at all possible, check with counsel on a case-by-case basis. So we have gone through a lot in a brief period of time here, but I wanted to just kind of issue spot with you. So if you're a church leader, you're somebody involved in Christian education, your kids go to a Christian school, these are some things you can be mindful of. As I close, I've shared this photo before, but I recently had the opportunity to talk to a group of Burmese students up in northern Indiana, and I continue to be blessed to be able to work with that community. And it just reminds me of the great kingdom work that Adoniram Judson did, the missionary that left the United States in 1812, 1813, across the world, suffered so much. His wife died, and now, all of these years later, his spiritual disciples, spiritual descendants, are leading their secular American classmates to Christ in Indiana, in Fort Wayne, Indiana. And it just reminds me, we talked about the discipleship drought, that I do believe that Christian education pouring into the next generation is one of the most, if not the most, task that we have in front of us right now with all of the challenges. And I came across this great quote by Adoniram Judson. He said this: "The motto of every missionary, whether preacher, printer, or schoolmaster, ought to be devoted for life." So for those of us that are called into Christian education, whether it's in the church context, really in the home, and specifically those that spend their days probably not making a whole lot of money, dealing with attitudes, dealing with all of these changes, dealing with parents, but trying to instill the truths of Scripture into the next generation. I just want to encourage you with what God's called you to do. It's so important, and we ought to, and definitely, as Adoniram Judson said, be devoted for life. All right, well, those are 5 challenges in the legal education space or in Christian education, and I'll just roll through those here once again. The first one was legal foundation, next employment, admissions and discipline, accreditation and tax exemption, and the Christian school and immigration. And so those are a couple of issues for you. Hopefully you can issue spot. If our organization, our ministry can be of help, do let us know, and we will talk to you next week.